I just watched a Bible movie, and I liked it. King of Kings is an independent Christian film that's based on The Life of Our Lord, which is a biography of Jesus of Nazareth that Charles Dickens wrote for his children. I hadn't heard of this book at all until I saw the marketing for the film, and there's a reason for that. Dickens retold parts of the Bible that cover the life of Jesus in simple, pleasant prose that would be easy for children to understand. His children, to be exact. Dickens read The Life of Our Lord to his children every year at Christmas, and he insisted that the manuscript should never be taken out of the house, copied, or published. If that makes him sound like a control freak, it's because he was. Charles Dickens was a great writer and did some wonderful humanitarian work in his life, but he was also a horrible husband and father. His kids held on to the manuscript, and years later the family agreed that it could be published after all of his children were dead. I have theories about all this, but I'll have to save it for another day. The Life of Our Lord mostly doesn't discuss doctrine, and I honestly think it makes a pretty good introduction to Christianity. Of course, if you and your family are Christian, then you'll enjoy reading it together. But even if you're not, I think it would be useful to have a read through it. It only takes about half an hour to read it, and it just goes over the basic biography of Jesus. When you consider how much of Western culture has been influenced by Christianity, and how often these Bible stories are referenced in art, architecture, theater, poetry, it would be really useful to just get a basic familiarity with these stories. So if you're looking for something that doesn't really hone in on a specific denomination or doesn't make moral or religious arguments in terms of like a Sunday school lesson, this is a really good book to pick up and check out. So let's take a look at King of Kings, which was put out this spring by Angel Studios, an independent production company that seems to be doing pretty well for itself. As always, I'll give a final score of 1 to 5 Snapes, not based on how good the film was, but how closely it matches the book it's based on. Oh, and I probably don't need to say this, but don't take this review as any kind of commentary on Christianity or Christians. I'm just reviewing a film. When the movie started, I thought I was seeing a trailer because it showed Ebenezer Scrooge crawling toward his own tombstone at the most critical moment of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. But then a cat meows and Scrooge pauses in confusion. It turns out this isn't a trailer for A Christmas Carol going on before the film, but it's the introduction to the film itself. Charles Dickens is on stage reciting his famous story, and so there's this really nice bit of theatrical sleight of hand where you have the fictional audience in the fictional theater watching fictional Charles Dickens, and then we film viewers are watching the film itself. So you have this nice kind of play within a play setting, and it's just really nice, and it introduces the idea that this film is going to be almost like one of those like nesting dolls where there's stories within stories, and then the walls between those stories start to be broken down and played with. And I think that's the genius of this film. This could have just been another Bible movie. There's a lot of them out there. Some people like them, some people hate them, some people think they're cheesy, some people think they're preachy. This one tried to be, above all else, a good storytelling experience. I do need to say that the characters of Charles Dickens and his wife Catherine in the film are nothing like the people from real life. Charles Dickens was one of the most important writers who ever lived. He was also, by the standards of his own day and ours, a terrible person. However, he's dead, and so are all the family members he abused. His writing belongs to the world now, and that matters more than the fact that he was a sad, petty, defective scrap of a man who did lots of good things, but was also a cruel, abusive, self-righteous hypocrite. The Charles and Catherine Dickens depicted in King of Kings are nothing like their real-life counterparts, so for the purposes of this review, I'm going to call them Chuck and Kathy. Chuck and Kathy had a great marriage. Charles and Catherine did not. The worst thing Chuck is guilty of is sometimes being a little uptight and getting frustrated with his kids when they're super obnoxious. Kathy's into gentle parenting and lets her annoying, entitled children bother other people all the time, but apart from that, she's a soft-spoken yet strong-willed partner to her husband. I like Kathy and Chuck, unlike Charles, who I detest, and Catherine, who I pity. So Chuck is on stage telling the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, and this does reflect reality because Dickens did go on tour. He even went to America once. However, the thing that's unrealistic is there's no way he would have had his kids backstage with them. Like, I know they needed this to set up the tension in the film, But it's very silly, especially since Catherine is just letting them run around and act like total maniacs. Kathy, I really want to be on your side, but you're literally like, oh, look at the cute little scamp swinging on the expensive theater equipment and disrupting the show. Gentle parenting is a mistake. Yeah, I said it. Chuck shouts at everybody, then goes back out to salvage what remains of the show while Kathy takes the kids home. Best choice you've made all night, Kathy. She also scoops up the manuscript, gets the pages back in order, and puts them in Chuck's office. When Chuck gets home, Kathy has reassembled the manuscript and learned what the story is. She tells her husband to read the story to little Walter in an effort to bring them back together. The real Catherine never would have been this assertive. Dickens was incredibly domineering, and he never would have, accepted her opinion, let alone her guidance on any issue to do with parenting, since he didn't even let her see her own children after he decided he was done with her. Seriously, he was an awful husband. Chuck begins to tell the story of the life of Jesus to Walter, who's only willing to listen because he likes stories about King Arthur and is curious to hear tales about the King of Kings. This is where the visual storytelling takes over. The reason why so many Bible films aren't really interesting to the general public is that they are telling stories that quite a lot of people know, and they're just telling them over and over again. What this movie does best is it dissolves the boundaries between the worlds. And then also, by focusing on the character of little Walter, you're not just hearing these Bible stories that are familiar parts of our culture, but what you're doing is you're watching a child discover them for the first time, and you're experiencing all of his emotions. And then they get animated together, like when Walter is hearing about King Herod, he's hiding behind the furniture and kind of lurking in the shadows because he is terrified of this wicked king. And so you're not just hearing the story, which is well told and well acted, but you're experiencing the emotions of this little kid who's absolutely immersed in the story. When Joseph and Mary are fleeing from the soldiers, you've got Chuck and Walter doing the same thing. They're running along. Now, at the beginning of the story, Chuck himself is still in control, though. He's playing along with Walter, but he himself hasn't been immersed yet. That does happen later in the story, and so it gives Chuck himself this opportunity to kind of rediscover these stories that he's told a million times. Chuck has his first moment of starting to reconsider stories that maybe he takes for granted when little Walter sees young Jesus walking along the road, and Walter says, "Oh, how old is he?" And then, Chuck says, "Oh, he's about your age." And Walter's reaction is so wonderful and childlike, and what he says is, "We could be friends." And then there's this kind of bemused look on Chuck's face where he thought, gosh, I wouldn't have thought of it that way. But it's the sort of childlike expression that I think Christians especially would appreciate and hope that their own children would feel. But even as a, non-Christian watching this film could appreciate that moment that, a kid is going to see another kid and want to relate to that person on a very human level. And it's just very sweet and innocent. I really like that moment. And it starts to be this turning point for Chuck where he begins to get drawn in more and more to the action. And as the boundaries between the worlds dissolve even more, he gets lost in the story. This film is, of course, firmly rooted in the Christian faith. But the life of our Lord stayed away from any doctrinal debates, sticking to the events as they're told in the Bible. The film wisely does the same thing, which means it'll appeal to believers from many denominations. For example, angels aren't physically depicted. There's such a bright light radiating from them that you can't tell if they're corporeal or not. The only point of doctrine in the film is that it did show Jesus being baptized by immersion. Some churches do a light sprinkling, and others are like, hey, that sin isn't coming off without a proper wash. But I don't think that this is really going to cause any big problems. Like a lot of folks these days, I grew up religious, but now I'm unaffiliated, and I still found this movie to be very beautiful and moving, particularly in its depiction of the character of Jesus. Doing a fictional version of Jesus is tricky. If you make him too godlike, he's unreachable. If you make him too human, then he can come across as diminished. The script and voice actors make Jesus into someone who feels very three-dimensional. He has a parental feel to him, showing infinite patience with the human beings who don't comprehend his mission, while never coming across as arrogant. Oscar Isaac's performance perfectly balanced gentleness and strength. In the famous scene where the woman caught in adultery is presented to Jesus to ask what punishment she should receive, The film really hammers home that true power is the kind where someone would never need to lift a sword. A few softly spoken words compel an angry crowd to disperse. I know that at this point some followers of the faith might be hoping I had a literal, actual come to Jesus moment, and that didn't happen, but I still really appreciated this movie, and I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm going to show it to my kids, and I think they'll love it too. Whatever your beliefs, if you want to tell stories for children, you should watch King of Kings, because this is how you do it. The people who made this movie loved the story they were telling. They wanted kids to love the story too, so they told it well, in a way that's meaningful and interesting to children. So I heartily endorse this film. If your family's Christian, you'll of course love it as a respectful and beautiful telling of the life of Jesus. But even if you're not, it's just a good story told well. But what do I do about the Snape score? Chuck and Walter and the cat aren't actually characters in the life of our Lord, although in the book, Dickens does address his children in the first person. King of Kings doesn't include everything in the life of our Lord, but it does accurately condense the Bible stories that Dickens related. I think I'll have to knock off one Snape because of the inaccurate depiction of Charles and Catherine's marriage, and then also because Chuck and Walter aren't actually characters in the life of our Lord. I'll have to do one more, so I think I'm going to settle on a score of 3 Snapes for King of Kings. A film's quality and its Snape score don't necessarily relate to one another. This is one of the best films I've seen in a while, and it shows how you can use a children's book as a starting point and then make a departure and still make a really enjoyable family film. Have you seen King of Kings? I'm guessing that if you're a churchgoer, you might have seen it back in the spring when it first came out. And then there's people like me who aren't churchgoers. So, I finally managed to get around to seeing it after all the summer holidays and all the chaos of all of that. But I'd really like to say again, whether or not you are Christian, I really think that this movie is worth seeing. It's so beautifully animated, it's really well acted, and it's just a beautiful, immersive piece of storytelling that can help you understand some pretty important stories as far as Western culture goes. But I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of it? Did you like it? Did you find it to be different from other Bible movies that you've seen before? And what kind of lessons do you think it can offer to people who want to tell interesting stories for children?